It all started with a big chill. Well, actually, it started with an even bigger void. This was Ginnungagap, the yawning chasm that had no bottom and no top and existed before all things. Two realms pressed against its vast emptiness. To one side lay Niflheim, the icy world of swirling mist, while to the other burning Muspelheim, the burning land of primal heat and elemental chaos. One day, a blot of ice broke off from Niflheim and fell into the void. Then another and then another, tumbling down like dust from a giant's hand until they formed a mound in the swirling mists. First she saw the darkness blooming in Bori's eyes, felt it coiling around his heart like a winter frost. Something was changing him, twisting him into something harder, colder, hungrier. So she turned from his game and went out to licking the ice blocks, hoping to find another sleeping giant to add to their company. But Odin only shook his head, his gaze sweeping across the bloody battlefield until it landed on Ymir once more. That became the earth, his sinews and ligaments forming rivers and rills that snaked across the land. Then they drained his blood and let it flow into the seas and oceans. Then the gods returned to the earth, where their handiwork was far from complete. So Odin sought out to draw footlots, and using his magical hammer, Mjolnir, imbued them with life, fashioning the first humans, Ask and Embla. He gave them breath, soul, mind and senses, along with the gift of speech and thought. Then Odin left them to grow and learn, knowing that they were destined to become wise and powerful in their own right. When that was done, they chopped his bones into jagged peaks and scattered them across the face of the earth. Each or so whose roots ran deep into the underworld Helheim and whose leaves brushed against the celestial halls of Valhalla. There was Midgard, the home of mortals, Asgard, where Odin and his fellow Aesir gods held court, Jotunheim, the land of giants, and Vidheim, the realm of fertility and magic. Helheim ruled by the goddess Hel, where the valiant dead went after their final battle in Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. And beyond the heavens, there was Alfheim, the shining home of the light elves, and Svartalfheim, the dark realm of the dark elves, or dwarves. His teeth and tusks were strewn about as boulders, while his skull formed the vaulted ceiling of the sky, held up by four dwarven brothers named Styr, Silver, Norse, and West. When the world would burn and the surviving gods would sail forth to Midgard and start the whole thing again. Still, as he looked down on Ask and Embla, he knew that their story had only just begun. Lastly, they boiled his brain in ale, turning it into clouds that drifted across the celestial dome. By the will of the gods, you live, he said at last. Then turning to his companions, he gave the order and they got to work. But just as quickly as it began, the deluge ended. She discovered only more of her own kin. Startled, Odin reached up and caught one in his belt pouch. Then squinting his eyes, he hurled it across the void. Immediately, the spark burst into flame, soaring across the sky, and Odin did the same with the rest, until the celestial dome blazed with fire. But as they watched, the flames sputtered and died, plunging the world into darkness. Odin frowned, and so he called on his brothers to stand beside him. Then together, they breathed life into the sparks. Some became the blazing sun, racing across the heavens during the day. Others became the watchful moon, gleaming by reflected light as she chased the sun's bright chariot across the sky. And the smaller sparks became the myriad stars that glittered in the darkness. Revulsion contorted his face, and with a vicious kick sent Ymir sprawling. But then, as if sensing the change in Ymir's demeanor, Bori grew still. He narrowed his golden eyes, gauging the distance to his brother's heart, and took a step forward. And in that instant, Ymir erupted. Every ounce of suppressed fury boiled over, and he charged at Bori, scattering the rocks and soil they had gathered across the void. She'd eaten every last giant from the mounds of ice. Their flesh tore and spilled across the ground. Ymir screamed in rage, but also in pain, for Bori's caused right deep, tearing great dashes in his sides. And in his agony, Ymir knew that he could not match Bori's strength, not any longer. So he bit down hard on the nearest rock, crunching it between his teeth until it turned to dust. Then he spat and roared, hurling the grit at Bori, blinding him. It was not much, but it was all he had. With each passing season, the cold receded and the fires of Muspelheim burned higher, looking closer to the giant's home. And with no other prey to devour, Odin turned to face her 3 charges. His shadows loomed large across the shrinking void. Yet they were as hard as granite now, unyielding and implacable. Their laughter had curdled into cruel taunts, their games into vicious fights over dominance. And though Ymir still recoiled at the sight of Bori, he would not flee his brother's mockery. But Bori, he had been buried deeper, shielded from the light. But when she licked away the final ice blocks, he too awoke and blinked his eyes open, revealing pools of molten gold. Now there was mischief in his eyes, and he nudged Ymir playfully, roaring with laughter. Roaring in surprise and pain as the dust clogged his eyes. In that moment, Odin appeared, riding a magnificent 8-legged horse. His eyes gleamed like chips of ice, his long beard flowing behind him in the wind, and without a word, he plunged his spear deep into Bori's chest, pinning him to the ground. Bori convulsed, thrashing wildly until Odin wrenched the spear free and raised it high above his head. Then he brought it down again and again, striking blow after blow until Bori lay still, silent at last. Yet Ymir only glared, for the very sight of Bori made him uneasy. There was a darkness in those molten eyes that he could not abide, and his unease only grew as the days passed and the 2 giants grew stronger, their boisterous game shaking the foundations of their new world. No more ice broke off from Niflheim. Yet the mountain grew ever larger, its peak scraping against the fiery realm of Muspelheim, and from that, sparks flew. Great bolts of flame that sizzled and spat, searing the cold rocks until they dripped like molten gold. And in those drops, life stirred in time. A giant awoke. He stretched and yawned, flexing enormous muscles. This was Ymir, the first giant, and he shook himself awake with a mighty roar that echoed across the void. But he wasn't alone. The giantess Altima, the cosmic cow, grazed nearby, her bright foaming clouds of vapor that swirled around Ymir's head like a fragrant halo. She had come from the icy realm of Nibelheim to feed upon the dripping ice, looking at the frozen blocks until they yielded their flavor, and in her legs she uncovered another being, a male giant named Bori, who slept cold beneath the ice like a hibernating bear. Altima had found Ymir easy enough, for his footsteps boomed across the void like distant thunder. The earth trembled as Ymir grappled with Bori, their shouts echoing across the empty void. Even Altima winced at their din. But after many seasons, Bori roared with laughter when he saw Ymir hesitate as the brothers grappled, yet Bori faltered at the gritty spray. When Ymir saw Odin, he swam to his knees, whimpering like a chastised hound. First, they skinned Ymir, stretching his flesh out across the void. Yet as they worked, sparks rained down from above, sizzling against the raw meat of the new world. With that, the brothers mounted their 8-legged horses and raced across the newly forged heavens, scattering the remaining sparks as they went, each star becoming the celestial prey of the fearsome wolves who snapped and snarled as they raced across the sky. For though they had formed the world, it was barren, empty. Now the Norse cosmos was vast and complex, encompassing 9 distinct worlds or 9 realms which were connected by the branches of the world tree. Yet despite the majesty of the cosmos, Odin always knew that its end was inevitable, that it would culminate in Ragnarok,